right to the shir. I'll share screen in terms of the Makorot. There's been some changes since I sent out the Makorot sheet on Tuesday or Monday night, and then I was looking at things over the last couple of days, and I came up with some new ideas, or not really new ideas, but what a new idea. And that's going to be reflected in what's on the screen. It's not too different from what you have printed. Very basically the same, except for one change, but which I'll point out as we go along. So now with regard to the screen, so hold on just 1 second. Here we go. Okay, does everyone see the Makorot? And I'll make it a little bit larger. And we'll begin. I was listening to the end of Rabbi Tropper's shir, and he spoke about some of the I guess you could say the philosophical and religious implications l'dorot of the man. I want to I'll touch upon that as well, but I want to more focus on some of the halachic implications that we have. There are basically two aspects of our meals on Shabbat, which are derived from the man. One of those aspects is which I'm not going to really speak about, which is explicit in the pasuk. Here, taking a look at the psukim in Perek Tet Zayin, the first source on your sheet. Vayhi bayom hashishi, on the sixth day, laktu lechem mishneh, shnei haomer leechad, vayavo kol nesi ha'eda vayagidu leMoshe. So on we have this lechem mishneh, and the Torah tells us exactly what that measurement was, that they brought that double measure and come to Moshe, and Moshe's response is, Hu asher diber Hashem Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh Lashem Machar. We'll come back to those words in a few minutes. Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh. This is a day of resting, we'll call it. And that term Shabbaton is something which is going to be very important for a third aspect, which we've spoken about a little bit in the past, when we had some shirim about electricity, the idea of Shabbaton being a fundamental mitzvat aseh of Shabbat, namely that that the day should be a special day of rest. How that's defined, not for us right now, and that we've spoken about in the past, some ideas with regard to that, but I don't want to get into that right now. Et asher tofu afu ve'et asher tavashlu bashelu. So whatever you're going to cook and bake, ve'et kol ha'odef hanichu lachem lemishmeret ad haboker, and leave the rest for the morning. Vayanichu oto ad haboker kasher tziva Moshe. By the way, again, I'm just pointing certain things out as we get into it, which we're not going to be focusing on. The implication isn't necessarily that it's, at this point that it's asur to bake and cook on Shabbat. All it's saying is that remember, it's Friday morning, and they have their food, and they're expecting 1/2 of the volume that actually was delivered. And now they come and they ask about this extra amount. So what Moshe is saying is prepare and eat. Et kol ha'odef hanichu lachem lemishmeret. So does that meaning that what you're going to eat now, cook, and then you'll do whatever you do with the rest tomorrow? Or is it saying cook everything and leave it prepared for tomorrow? So you can read it either way. Again, not all that relevant for the moment to the topic of the shir, with regard to the notion of Seuda Shlishit, of the third meal. So they did leave it till the following morning. Kasher tziva Moshe v'lo hivish v'rima lo hayta bo. So it didn't spoil, and there were no worms in it. Vayomer Moshe, and this is the pasuk that we're going to be focusing on, pasuk chafei. Vayomer Moshe ichluhu hayom, eat it today. Ki Shabbat hayom Lashem, but because Shabbat is the day for Hashem. Hayom lo timtzeu basadeh. Today you will not find it in the field. So here, I mean, it's a it's a classic biblical verse, right? For today is the Sabbath. Today you will not find it in the field. What is going on in terms of this repetition and the importance of the Hayom? We're going to see what the Midrashim do with that in just 1 second. Sheshet yamim tilketu vayom hashvi Shabbat lo yebo. Gather it for 6 days. On the 7th day, it's Shabbat, and you're not going to find it in the field. Fine. That's the psukim. Now, we understand, you can look at it, and it's important to look at it from the perspective in terms of what's going on in the Midbar and what lessons we learn throughout our lives from what happened to the Jews during that critical period of Yetziat Mitzrayim and their sojourn in the desert, and what messages we take from that going forward for L'Dorot. Here we are speaking more than 3,300 years later. But I want to focus, as I said, on the halachic implications, and specifically with regard to what happens in terms of our Seudot Shabbat. And there are 2 primary issues here in terms of Seudot Shabbat. The first I mentioned at the beginning, that Liktu Lachem Lechem Mishneh, we'll put that in maybe back to the green, that you have this mitzvah of having 2 loaves as part of the meals of Shabbat. And then we have this other idea, which isn't mentioned at all in the psukim, and that's the mitzvah of Seuda Shlishit. How do we get Seuda Shlishit from this story? That's not totally clear. Where does that come from? In terms of it, it's not mentioned explicitly that you're going to have 3 meals on Shabbat as opposed to 2 meals which you regularly eat. So where does that come from? So that's not totally clear. So let's take a look at, and this is the change from the first version and the second version. So those of you who printed it out, please take a look at the screen, and I'm happy to later on post the updated version of the Korot if anyone wants to print it out and look at it later. There is 2 versions of this idea. The idea which is the more famous one, and that's what I put on the sheet initially, was the rendition found in the Gemara on Shabbat, Daf Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Bet. There, the Gemara speaks about, within the context of talking about Lechem Mishneh, first it says, B'Shabbat Amar Rabbi Abba, the left-hand part of the left-hand column of the table, Amar Rabbi Abba, B'Shabbat Chayav Adam Livtzo Al Shtei Kikarot, Tichtiv Lechem Mishneh. So that's the first halacha. You have 2 loaves. The pasuk says Lechem Mishneh. We have it. Fine. Then, and there's a discussion with regard to Lechem Mishneh, and which I deleted here. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we come to Seuda Shlishit. Kama Sudot Chayav Adam Lechol B'Shabbat. How many meals does a person need to eat on Shabbat? And here you have the first opinion, 3. Rabbi Chidka Amar, and there is this Rabbi Chidka, who is not a well-known Tana. He says 4. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan, who is the 3rd generation, or 2nd generation, excuse me, Amora in Eretz Yisrael. He's living in the 4th century. And he says, Shnehem mikra echad darshu. V'amru vayomer Moshe. They both learned from the same pasuk. What is that pasuk? The pasuk that we saw before, pasuk Chavei. Vayomer Moshe ichluhu hayom, ki Shabbat hayom lashem. Hayom lo timtzuu b'sadeh. They both learn it from the same pasuk. You have the idea of Shabbat, Hashem is Lashem, but there is 3 times. This is what's important. The 3 times that the word hayom, and I'll just underline it, the 3 times that the word hayom appears in the pasuk. And because of those 3 days, we have a drasha, 3 times, 3 meals. Rabbi Chidka Savar, so Rabbi Chidka believes that there are 4 meals on Shabbat, not 3. And Rabbi Chidka says, Hani tlata hayom levar me'urta. That didn't include the nighttime meal. Because after all, what is Moshe saying? Hayom, they come, generally speaking, in the morning to talk about the food situation. This is when the man would fall overnight, and they would gather it in the morning. So they gathered it on Friday morning. They saw the extra food, and now Moshe is telling them, eat it. And the following day, ichluhu hayom, right? Because on Pasuk Chav Daled, remember they bayanichu oto ad haboker, not knowing exactly what to expect. They leave it, they come to Moshe, Moshe says, ichlu hayom, so it's the morning time. And so Rabbi Chidka says, so we don't include last night's meal. There are an additional 3 hayoms to tell me that there are 3 meals during the daytime. You'll eat your night meal, you'll go to sleep, you eat a little bit of the kiddush, then you have your lunch, and then you have what we call Seuda Shlishit. Rabbanan Savrei, Bahade de Orta. Okay, so the Chachamim, Rabbi Yochanan explains, is no, the Hayom, the first Hayom, is referring to the meal that already had been consumed the night before, and there's only a chiyuv for 2 meals. Now, it's a drasha, and we'll talk a little bit more as to whether this is understood as being a drasha on the level of a deoraita, or it's a lesser drasha, but the drasha isn't totally clear. I mean, what's the drasha coming from, really? I mean, you have hayom, hayom, hayom. Okay, so there is repetition in the pasuk. I get it, and so we connected to a custom that we're familiar with. It seems to be somewhat tenuous that you would have this, but okay, that's the way it is. I want to try to perhaps see if there is a deeper understanding of that pasuk, and I'll get to that in just one moment. Then the Gemara continues, here the Gemara says, okay, there's now a different section in terms of this Gemara, where the Gemara talks about naflat leika b'leilei Shabbat, where there is now if God forbid there's a fire in someone's home, and it's a situation which is rare, where there is clearly not a pikuach nefesh situation. Just to give you a background for the Gemara, we're going to refer back to the Gemara. I didn't bring you the whole text. It's not too relevant to us right now. But here's the situation. There's a fire. You get everybody out of the house. You're in a situation where you know the flames will not spread, and that the only damage that's going to happen on Shabbat is the damage of losing all your possessions. And to make things worse, you're in a situation where you don't have an eruv. You're taking anything outside is going to perhaps be a problem of carrying. So all of this is going on. And then the Gemara talks about what are you allowed to save? Are you allowed to take things out? Not allowed to take things out. And basically, the halacha is you're not supposed to take anything out other than the food that is needed for Shabbat. So if the fire breaks out right on Friday night from the Shabbat candles, so then take enough, remove enough food to eat 3 meals outside. And if the fire breaks out on Shabbat morning, then you only need enough food to take for 2 meals. And in this context, the question is, well, according to Rabbi Chidka, you need 4 meals and 3 meals. And according to the Chachamim, it's 3 meals and 2 meals. And what happens if it falls out in the afternoon? So then you only take out enough food for 1 meal because that's all that's left. So that's basically the context of the Gemara. And as I said, the details for me right now are less important, but I wanted you to be aware that that sugya is there. Okay, and we're going to refer back to it halacha l'maaseh, but also and when I say halacha l'maaseh, I mean in situations where there is no fire and you're not saving food. As I said, and I just want to stress this because of the importance of the overall concept. As I said, it's basically a hypothetical, at least in terms of the way that our homes are set up. And our properties are set up. If there's a fire that breaks out virtually in any circumstance in where people live today, you have to take into account the possibility that even if you think it's a small possibility, but usually it's not that small a possibility, that the fire will not be contained, that the fire can spread. And we've seen situations like that. Unfortunately, a few years ago when we had the brush fires that were breaking out. So if there is a small chance that the fire is going to spread, so then you do everything that you need to prevent a pikuach nefesh situation in someone else's home. So that's but as I said, that's really not the topic, but we obviously have to stress the importance of pikuach nefesh on Shabbat. Finally, the Gemara now, and I did not bring this last part of the Gemara in the first sheet. So take a look here. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. It was after a more than an Amud discussion of the implications of fires on Shabbat. Then the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Mishum bar kapara, kol ha-mekayem shalosh seudot b'Shabbat, nitzol mishalosh puraniyot. So the Gemara feels it's important to bring the words of a very early Amora, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. He's a student of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And he says, and he actually quotes a contemporary of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Mishum bar Kapara. It's a going back to the time of the Tanaim, the following Misorah, that anyone who fulfills Shalosh Sudot b'Shabbat, keeps those 3 meals, is careful about it, so you are saved from Shalosh Puraniot, 3 terrible punishments that will happen. What are they? Mechevlo shel Mashiach, from the birth pangs of the Mashiach, the difficulty of the time immediately preceding the coming of the Messiah. Midina shel Gehenom, from judgment in Gehenna, and Milchemet Gog uMagog, and from having to see and live through Milchemet Gog uMagog. And then the Gemara gives proof texts to these ideas, and each of the proof texts, I'm not going to read them now because I want to get to the halacha, but the key word again is yom, right? The idea again of the yom, the yom evra, and when it comes to biyom ba gog umagog. And similarly, on a more perhaps prosaic level, that the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Kol ha'ma'aneg et haShabbat, notnin lo. Second, just 1 second. On my screen, it's gotten mixed. Okay, the Kol ha'ma'aneg et haShabbat, notnin lo nachala b'li mitzarim. So anyone who keeps the Shabbat, so he receives an inheritance without any borders, as titaneg al Hashem, because of the pasuk of Al Titaneg Al Hashem. So what's the connection here? We're not talking about general mitzvah of oneg. We're talking about specifically the mitzvah of Seuda Shlishit. What's going on? Okay, that's there, and we'll perhaps come back to that as well. What I had not been aware of, and this is, as I said, when I prepared these shurim, and I take opportunities to look at things that perhaps I haven't seen before, and this is one of the things that I had not seen before, and that was the Mechilta. The Mechilta is a collection of midrashei halacha that is focused on Sefer Shemot and is organized based in the order of the Sefer. So I took an opportunity to take a look at the Mechilta on these psukim. And I saw something which was, to my mind, noteworthy, maybe even more than noteworthy. Because I just want to pause before I read the Mechilta and just talk about the difficulties that come from the text. In other words, of the Gemara that we just read. Again, why should the fact that the Torah say Hayom 3 times tell us that means that we're now having more meals? What's the connection there? Where does that come from? And why does the Gemara bring this last text of the importance of the 3 meals, to the extent that if you eat 3 meals on Shabbat, you're going to be freed from this, these terrible cataclysmic events, whether it's on the personal level of Dinah Shel Gehenom, on the world level of Gog and Magog, of the Chavlei Mashiach. I just had a little herring and crackers for my shalashudas. It's good herring. But that is the shalosh Seuda. So that just doesn't. Those are my problems that I have here when I'm taking a look at the psukim. The Mechilta gives me a different version. First, it creates other problems, but I think that the problems, and certainly taking a look at the Gemara as a reflection of the Mechilta. Mechilta predates the Gemara, and the Mechilta, it could be whether the Tanu Rabbanan that the Gemara refers to here. Remember, it starts with that a Braita, and frequently those Braitot are Braitot that are taken from Midrashei Halacha. So is it taken from our Midrash Halacha and it's a different version of it, or is it a parallel? I don't know. But this is what the Mechilta says. Vayomer Moshe ichluhu hayom. So the Mechilta starts with the pasuk Perek Tet Zayin, pasuk Chafei, that we have been referring to. Ki Shabbat hayom Hashem hayom lo timtzu basadeh. Rabbi Zerika Omer. Is the Rabbi Zerika the same as Rabbi Chidka? They are similar words. The letters in Aramaic will transpose themselves. I don't know whether it's necessarily the same person. Mikan shalosh sudot b'Shabbat. So here he talks about 3 sudot. There's not the discussion of 3 or 4. Just we'll say 3 sudot, whether it's an additional 3 to the Friday night meal and that gives you 4, or whether that is 3 including the Friday night meal. We'll leave that aside. Not important for me now. But now there's an expansion of why the Hayom should have the connection to the idea of Shalosh Sudot. Why? Lefi shahayu regilin latzeit b'shacharit. And by the way, also there is if you take a look at Rashi on the pasuk, Rashi, without quoting the Mechilta, gives a synopsis and an edited version of this. Lefi shahayu regilin latzeit b'shacharit. They would go out every morning to gather the man, and in the morning, Amrulo, Moshe Rabbeinu, Neitzei b'shacharit. So it's time to go out, because remember, this is actually what they said in the morning. They haven't gone out yet. They've just gone, and now they come to Moshe and they say, "Okay, should we go out?" And Moshe says to them, "Ichluhu hayom." No, eat what you already have left over. Eat it today. Okay. Amrula. So they said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Ho'il v'lo yatzanu shacharit neitzei ben ha'arbayim. Since we didn't go out in the morning, it's now, it's mincha time. Maybe we should go out now and see if there's going to be some more food out there. Maybe on Shabbat it falls in the afternoon. There's a late shacharit, late davening. Kadosh Baruch Hu sends the food a little bit later. Amar lahem ki Shabbat hayom l'Hashem. So no, Shabbat hayom l'Hashem. There's not going to be any food out there. You don't have to go out now. Uma Talmud lomar hayom lo timtzuu basadeh. So the Midrash asks, so then why was it necessary for Moshe to add the last few words of the pasuk? Today you will not find it in the field. Amrulo bakal liban shalavotenu. Amru, not amrulo. It was said, meaning there's a misorah of the Dorot that the Midrash is reporting. Bakal libenu shalavotenu ba'otasha. So the hearts of our forefathers were broke at that moment. There was doubt. Shahayu omrim. What was the doubt? The doubt is the following: Ho'il v'lo mitza'anuhu hayom, shema lo nimtza'ehu l'machar. So maybe, you remember, this is the first Shabbat. This is the first time that there has been a break in the man. And maybe it's not a break. Maybe it's all over. Maybe it was a 1 week phenomena, and tomorrow we're going to have to figure out how we're going to eat all over again. Amar lahem, hayom hazeh I atem motziim oto, aval atem motziim oto lemachar. So he said the following: if today you're not going to find it, but tomorrow you will find it. Rabbi Lezer Chisma Omer, Ba'olam hazeh atem motziim oto, aval la'olam haba atem motziim oto. So now Rabbi Lezer ben Chisma, or Rabbi Lezer Chisma, he says something which seems to be a bit of a non sequitur. He's saying, today in this world you won't find it. In the next world you will find it. I don't get that. The first answer I understand, because basically what it's trying to say is, today they're not going to find the food, but don't worry, there'll be food tomorrow. And Rabbi Eliezer Chisma, so that's why you have it the third time. Now the Midrash here, before I get to Rabbi Eliezer Chisma's problem, the Midrash doesn't try to talk to me and to explain to me, well, how does this connect with 3 meals all along? Okay, in other words, there are 2 meals. There's the meal of the hayom, right? Ichluhu hayom, the first ichluhu, the first hayom. You have the meal of the second one where it says Shabbat hayom l'Hashem. I get that. That's fine. Perfect. Now the third one is just Moshe reassuring the Jewish people that they're going to have food on Sunday morning too. So how does the Sunday bagel and lox translate to the shalashudas of the tuna and the herring? Where does that come from? How does that connect? Why should I have a third meal? Because I know tomorrow there's going to be food. Medrash doesn't say anything. And then Rabbi Eliezer Chisma trying to connect this and saying, Ba'olam hazeh yatem motzim oto, l'olam haba, you will find it. What does that mean? Find what? You're going to find the man in the next world? You're not going to find any man in the next world. There is no man. We're talking about in the Midbar. What's the connection? It's total non sequitur. Where's that coming from? To make matters worse, or perhaps this is the solution. The Gemara, the Midrash continues. There's some other sections that would tie into it, but our time is already short. I didn't want to get too involved with the reading the Medrash. The Medrash continues and says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Im tizku lishmor et Shabbat. Pay attention to those words. Im tizku lishmor et Shabbat. If you will keep the Shabbat, tinatzlu mishalosh puraniot. So then you will be saved from the 3 puraniot. What are they? Miyomo shel Gog, ubagog, bechevlo shel Mashiach. Miyom hadin hagadol, Yom hadin hagadol. I assume that what Gemara is what the Gemara called the Gehenna. So here you have the same 3 ideas. Lekach nemar ichluhu hayom. That's why it says ichluhu hayom. Okay. Now, what's the connection that's going on here? And Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, if you look right across to the left side of the table, now the way that the Gemara brought it was Kol hamekayim shalosh su'udot b'Shabbat nitzol mishalosh puraniyot. If you have 3 meals, Rabbi Eliezer didn't talk about 3 meals, he talked about tizku lishmor et Shabbat. So what's the connection? I think that everything flows, and with this I'll go into the halacha, but everything flows from this middle line, that's the first line in the blue. Baka liban shlavotenu ba'ota sha'a. That our forefathers had doubts at that moment. What was the doubt? Ho'il v'lo matzanu hayom shema lo nimtze'ehu l'machar. Since we didn't find it today, we're not going to have food tomorrow. In our world, thank God, this has become less and less of a problem. The idea that people are concerned that if you don't work on Shabbat, you're not going to be able to have food. You're not going to be able to have parnasah the entire week. The idea that, best summed up by what was told to many a Jewish immigrant to the West at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. If you don't show up on Saturday, don't come in on Monday. We only have we have a 6-day work week here. And the one day that is a day of rest is Sunday. You don't show up on on Saturday, don't bother coming in on Monday. You're fired. And the question is, are you able to have emunah that you're going to keep your Shabbat and still have parnasah the beginning of the next work week? That's really the question. And that has been a universal problem for the Jewish people from the very beginning of time, and especially from the time when the Mishnah and the Gemara and this Midrash is being written in conflict with the Roman world. The Roman world, and you see this from many different writings, was very, very critical of the idea of resting on Shabbat and not being involved with melacha. They viewed it as a sign of laziness of Jewish society, and that the idea not to work on Shabbat is something which is an anathema to Roman society. It's not a coincidence that one of the major aspects of the persecutions in the Hadrianic era, and which is when these texts are being written immediately after the Hadrianic era, are coming because of Shmirat Shabbat. If people were not willing to work on Shabbat, that could be a capital offense. And so here, the voicing of the concern of the Dor HaMidbar is a voicing of concern of the Jew, L'chol HaDorot. And what God is telling, Moshe is telling them in terms of God, is that no, Hayom Hazeh Yatem Motzim Oto, Aval Atem Motzim Oto L'machar. But you will find it tomorrow. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer Chisma can say, Ba'olam hazeh yatem motzim oto. In other words, even if you don't find, the parnasah that Jews had, the 10, 15% of Jews who decided when they came to the West not to work on Shabbat, was frequently less, was less comfortable than their compatriots who decided to be mechalel Shabbat and work on Shabbat. And by the way, I want to make it clear, I'm not judging. I have no idea what I would have done 100 years ago, 150 years ago, coming to the shores of New York City and being faced with a question of keeping food on the table for my family or not working on Shabbat. But the fact is that the small minority that decided to continue to keep Shabbat, so they did not necessarily have the same quick or as quick a climbing of the social ladder in America, in England, or wherever else they went. And so that's what Rabbi Eliezer Chisma is saying. Even if you don't see it tomorrow, even if you don't see it ba'olam hazeh, you will see it ba'olam haba. The schar is there. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer at the end of the Mechilta says, Im tizku lishmor et haShabbat. He doesn't talk about keep eating 3 meals. He says keeping Shabbat. That's when tinatzlu mishalosh puraniot. If you are faithful in God and you keep the Shabbat regardless of the situation, so then you will be able to have those, you'll be saved from those great cataclysmic events at the end of time. Right? So that's what Rabbi Eliezer is saying. Now we focus or we pivot onto our Gemara. Our Gemara takes it and says, Seuda Shlishit. Remember, the beginning of the Mechilta was, just to go back to that Mechilta, was Shalosh Seudot b'Shabbat. That's where we're coming from. Even in the Mechilta, it doesn't ask, where do I know that I should be keeping Shabbat? It's saying, where should I be eating 3 meals on Shabbat? The 3 meals that you eat on Shabbat are symbolic of the fact that you're not working on Shabbat, because they didn't work. What was their work? Their work was to go out and gather the food in the field and prepare it. So that's all they had to do, or had to refrain from doing on their Shabbat. So that becomes symbolic for everything that we have to do or not to do on our Shabbat. So eating Seuda Shlishit is basically saying I am keeping the Shabbat. If I eat my Seuda Shlishit, it's saying that I prepared it yesterday. It means that everything is here, and I believe that Shabbat Hayom Lashem, and that tomorrow I'll find it in the Sadeh. That's what the importance of Seuda Shlishit is. And now I can understand what happened in our Gemara. Our Gemara is working off our Mechilta, but it's focusing on the Shalosh Seudot. And now, therefore, it becomes not a question of Tizku Lishmor et Shabbat, as the Mechilta said, but it's rather Kol Mekayem Shalosh Seudot b'Shabbat. And it's not just eating 3 meals, it's Mekayem Shalosh Seudot b'Shabbat. That you understand what lies behind it, that you have this importance of the akiyum of Shalosh Seudot. Then you're saved from the Shalosh Puranot. I just want to close this part of the shir with an observation that I heard, I think the first time about 40 years ago from Rabbi Riskin. I've heard him say it a few times since, but it struck me at the time. I was in high school at the time, and it's something which has resonated with me. Rabbi Riskin pointed out what he said was a sociological fact. I don't know 40 years later whether it still necessarily holds true, but it's close enough. At the time, he said, if you want to know what is in common for every person today who views himself as a Jew, not religious Jew, not an Orthodox Jew, not Shomer Shabbat, simply, do you view yourself as Jewish? What is the one common denominator of every person who views themselves as a Jew. He said what the common denominator is that you have a great-grandparent who was Shomer Shabbat. If you don't have a great-grandparent who's Shomer Shabbat, so then you probably don't view yourself as a Jew anymore. At that point, you have become assimilated. It takes 3 generations. Maybe it's not great-grandparent, maybe it's great-great-grandparent. But that is a sociological fact which holds true in the overwhelming majority, probably more than 95%, 99% of the cases. And the reason for it is this Mechilta. The reason for it is this Gemara, because what it's saying is that those people who didn't keep Shabbat, they never thought they were going to stop being Jewish. They never thought that their children were going to stop being Jewish. And it holds for a few generations the idea of the sense, call it being part of the tribe, call it being the sociological connections that you have. But eventually the bonds break. And if you're keeping Shabbat, so then the bonds don't break. And that's the idea. That's why you have the further parts of this Mechilta and the Gemara. That's why you have the Olam Haba afterwards. That's why you have the idea of Tinatzlu Mishalosh Puraniot, other parts of the Gemara and the Mechilta, which I didn't quote here. And we'll say, we'll go on from here in terms of having hopefully established the significance of Seuda Shlishit, not important in terms of having a third meal, but rather as being a symbol of keeping Shabbat in the first place. So then we can now understand, have a better understanding of the halachic ramifications as well. So here we go. The first question I want to talk about is the question whether or not it is the mitzvah of eating 3 meals on Shabbat. Is this a d'oraita or is this a d'Rabbanan? There is what seems to be a machloket in this score. The first source I'm here is bringing here is the Lavush. The Lavush is which was very popular for a few hundred years and today is less popular. And basically, Rav Mordechai Yafeh, who, as you can see from lived in the, was basically a student of the Ramah. Okay, so he was so he's living in the latter half of the 16th century, right after the Shulchan Aruch has been published. So now he is, he basically, as a student of the Ramah, he felt that the tour, the Beit Yosef, was too long, and the Shulchan Aruch was too short. So he went ahead and wrote a guide using the same simanim of the tour, but making it a more expansive version of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, obviously using his own understanding of what the halacha should be. As I said, it was a very popular work for a few centuries. And the most important commentary on it, which is the next source, the Eliyahu Rabbah, was actually published together with the Shulchan Aruch, and people don't understand sometimes because the comment doesn't match the Shulchan Aruch because it's matching the Lavush. Okay, that's just a historical background. Anyway, the Lavush, talking about in the mitzvah, this is the siman of Reish Tzadi Aleph that talks about Seuda Shlishit. And in the idea of Seuda Shlishit, he says the following: Yez za'ir ma'od l'kayem Seuda Shlishit, v'hi min haTorah gam ken. So be very careful and understand that it is a d'oraita. He says it explicitly that this is a mitzvah d'oraita, that you should keep the Seuda Shlishit shchein darshu michtiv tatazimne, and he brings the pasuk. He says, after all, it's a medrash based on a pasuk, d'oraita. Period. That's it. However, as I said, his major commentary, the Eliyahu Rabbah, and you can see the dates. He lived about 100 years after Rav Mordechai Yaffe, though they both lived in Prague. So he says the following, that indeed there are those who view it as d'oraita. He brings some other sources. However, there is a idea based on other sources that say that it is d'Rabbanan. Sheshalosh sudot d'Rabbanan, shalosh hayom asmachta. You can understand this whole idea of it being d'Rabbanan, and you bring a pasuk. The pasuk is an asmachta. Basically, I have a rabbinic halacha, and then I look backwards trying to find some kind of connection that I can find within the context of the Torah. I can look at the connection here retrospectively because this is dealing with the man, this is dealing with the Lechem Mishnah, which is connected, and there's also a question whether Lechem Mishnah is d'oraita, but we'll leave that aside. But basically, it's within the context of eating our meals on Shabbat. We have these extra words of Hayom 3 times, wonderful, it works. But it's basically a d'Rabbanan deal. It's not a mitzvah d'oraita. The Rambam, when he speaks of this, the Rambam seems, he doesn't discuss the question directly, but it's pretty clear that he understands that it's rabbinic. Why do I say that? Or perhaps somewhere in the middle that it's a mitzvah from the Nevi'im. Why do I say that? Because the Rambam, who organized things, as we all know, very carefully, the Rambam, in the last parak of Hilchot Shabbat, so he discusses the mitzvah of kavod and oneg on Shabbat. That's what the parak is devoted to. And so here, the Rambam says that there are arba dvarim ne'emru b'Shabbat, shnayim min haTorah, shnayim min divrei sofrim, v'hein mefurashin al yedei hanevi'im. So there are 2 mitzvot that are d'oraita, and there are 2 mitzvot which are rabbinic, and they were already stated by the Nevi'im. What are the mitzvot d'oraita? Zachor and Shamor. Okay, that what the Rambam understood where the mitzvah of Kiddush came from. That's Zachor. Mitzvah of Shamor, that's the mitzvah of the lo ta'aseh, of not doing malacha. Great. Then you have Shenit Parshu al yedei hanevi'im, kavod va'oneg. So this is the mitzvah of kavod and oneg, is the, we'll call it the prophetic mitzvot. And the pasuk that we're familiar with, v'karata l'shabbat oneg, v'lakadosh Hashem mechubad. So here I have oneg, I have kavod. Then the Rambam from halacha aleph through halacha vav discusses the mitzvah of kavod of Shabbat. Basically, mitzvah of kibud Shabbat is what you do before Shabbat to prepare for Shabbat. That's kavod Shabbat. Oneg is what you do on Shabbat to enjoy Shabbat. Okay, fine. That's halacha, now halacha zayin, ezuhu oneg, and he starts talking about what oneg is, and that you have, first and foremost, you have a wonderful meal, l'taken, tavshil, shamen biyoter, umashkem mevusam. You should have as fat a dish as possible, and as scented a wine as full a wine as possible, based on your budget. Hakol lefi mamono shel adam, and then saying how the more that you expend on Shabbat, the better. Good. That's the mitzvah of oneg, and within that context, chayav adam le'achol shalosh sudot b'Shabbat, achat arvit, achat shacharit, achat b'mincha. So you should eat 3 meals. The Rambam doesn't give the source, and the Rambam frequently doesn't give sources. But clearly he's referring back to our Gemara, perhaps to the Mechilta, and basically saying this is part and parcel of the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat. My idea of Oneg Shabbat is that you eat quantitatively as well as qualitatively. The first halacha, halacha zayin, we spoke about the qualitative difference between the food that you eat on Shabbat as opposed to the food that you eat on the rest of the week. And on in the halacha tet, he speaks about the quantities. right? That the quantity should be not only the 2 meals that people normally eat every day of the week, but you should have 3 meals. And that's the part of very, very important. Afilu aniya mitparnes min tzedakah. The Rambam says, even if you're dealing with a person who is supported by charity, he should also have 3 meals. And now we'll skip the next line we'll come back to it in just 1 second. However, the Rambam says, "V'tzarich likvoa kol suda mishloshtan alav hayayin ulivtzoa al shtei kikarot." So the Rambam says this is that all 3 meals should have kiddush, the same way that you have kiddush on Friday night, and you have with wine, and you have Shabbat morning. So you should have, according to the Rambam, with your Seuda Shlishit, you should have wine and Livtzoa Shtei Kikarot, and you should have Lechem Mishnah as well. And the Rambam continues, and we'll talk about this too, namely, V'chein b'yamim tovim. And so this is also on Yom Tov. So those are your halachot, right? That you have 3 meals quantitative. Everyone should keep to it. Perhaps the Rambam wants to stress this afilu ani mitparnes min tzedakah, because he had said before, hakol lefi mamono shel adam, everything in terms of the quality of the meals. So there you're going to be you're going to be focused on your budget. But when it comes to having 3 meals, so it's not based on budget. There you have to have 3 meals, and the Gabayei Tzedakah have to make sure that even poor people who are getting kitchen should have enough meals, or have 3 meals. It's very similar halacha to Arba Kosot on Leil HaSeder. Now, the Rambam in between, so one last point before I get the in between, the Rambam basically is saying that these 3 meals are part of Oneg Shabbat. If they're Oneg Shabbat, so there is no difference, there shouldn't be any difference between the meal that you eat on Friday night and the meal that you eat on Shalashudas in terms of the importance. Basically, what the Torah is saying is that, or the Chachamim are saying, that you have 3 meals, and to express your Oneg Shabbat, when I express my Oneg Shabbat, so presumably each one of those meals has equal importance, and that's why it has Lechem Mishnah. That's why there's a Kiddush that's involved with it as well. Similarly, on Yom Tov, that's why it can be Yamim Tovim. Yom Tov also has a mitzvah of Simcha and of Oneg. So when I'm eating my meals on Yom Tov, so again, it should be extra meals. There should be 3 meals according to the Rambam. We'll see that that's not the halacha of the Shulchan Aruch, but still, you should have 3 meals, and each one of those meals has equal importance. What happens though in the middle? This is where the Rambam knows, what happens to us, especially, let's say, during the winter when the day is short. So patur b'shalosh sudot. So I have just a practical problem. Practical problem is that there are times that the 3rd meal is just difficult for me to eat. I've had a very full lunch, and it's now 2 hours later. I'm not going to be able to eat a Seuda Shlishit. So then I'm patur mishalosh Seuda. Because again, the Rambam is saying there's no mitzvah per se of 3 meals, like arba minim. Right, you have the lulav, the etrog, and hadasim and aravot. You have to have all 4. So I have to have 3 meals. Right, there's no mitzvah in that regard. There's a expression of Oneg Shabbat, and generally speaking, having an extra meal is a good expression of a special day. That's what the Rambam is saying is need for shit. But if I am ill as a result, so then I don't have to eat the Seuda Shlishit. But whatever meals I have the mitzvah of Kiddush, I have the mitzvah of Lechem Mishnah. That's the Rambam. Now, so again, we see this machloket, whether it's Doraita it's Drabanan, or the Rambam's idea is saying that you could call it rabbinic or prophetic, Nevi'im already saying it, but it's an expression of the idea of Oneg Shabbat that we have. Are there any practical differences? So the answer is yes. There are some practical nafkaminot, and here are two. One is the question of prioritizing. So we spoke about a person who is poor. What happens if a person is dirt poor? Mi she'ein yado maseged liknot ner Chanukah ner Shabbat. So here, this is a mitzvah found in Hilchot Chanukah. So if you are unable to have enough money to purchase a ner Shabbat and a ner Chanukah, and you can understand even in earlier generations how poor you have to be to reach that point. Yikneh ner Shabbat mipnei shalom beita. So then the halacha is prioritizing ner Shabbat is more important than ner Chanukah, because of shalom bayit. Okay, fine. That's the first halacha. However, v'im yesh lo l'shel Shabbat ve'en lo l'ner Chanukah u'liyayin yikneh l'ner Chanukah mishum pirsum hanes. So if you don't have enough money for ner Chanukah and wine for Friday night, so then ner Chanukah takes precedence. That's which is a retelling of the Gemara in Shabbat, in the second parak of Shabbat. The Taz, who is one of the primary commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, also a student of the Ramah. So he says the following, more of the Bach, Nirel inyan hapat the kulei alma pat kodem. He says, what about bread? Right? Okay, you have yain comes before ner Chanukah comes before the wine for kiddush. But if you don't have enough food on the table, which takes precedence, ner Chanukah or having food on the table? So he says, of course, food comes first. The lechem mishnah hu kodem layayin kiddush. The halechem mishnah lekulei alma d'oraita. So the wine for kiddush is derabanan. You can be mekayim the mitzvah of kiddush zachor by just simply saying mekadesh Shabbat. But to eat lechem mishnah, he believes that's d'oraita, and then based on the pasuk that we said at the beginning of the Gemara, that lechem mishnah v'shalosh seudot gam kein d'oraita upat ba'ina. So he says because the 3 meals are d'oraita, and you should have bread for them, because here's that understanding of the way the Rambam understands it, that it's part of the larger mitzvah of oneg, but rather that there is a kiyum d'oraita of hayom, 3 different meals. So you have to eat 3 meals, and you have to have bread, as was said in the Siman Reish Ayin Daled, Kodem l'ner Chanukah, because Chanukah is only d'Rabbanan. So if you hold, so he's saying that the mitzvah of lechem mishnah and the mitzvah of the of shalosh sudot are d'oraita, so you have to have those 3 things regardless. They take precedence over mitzvah of Chanukah. So that's one ramification. Another ramification, which is a question which many people are not necessarily aware of. Are women also chayavot in shalosh seudot on Shabbat? Is it a mitzvah of, does it fall within the larger rubric of Shabbat? Does it not fall within the rubric of Shabbat, and it becomes a mitzvah aseh sha'azman grama, a time-based mitzvah, and women are pturot? So here it is universally held that women are chayavot, but the 2 reasons that are given, and the reasons are very different. What is the Gemara doesn't talk about it. It's a question that was raised amongst the Rishonim, and I'll just quote, taking one of the later Rishonim, in the Ran, the beginning of the 14th century. So the Ran says the following: Katav Rabbeinu Tam, the Nashim chayavot b'shalosh Seuda. Women are chayavot in shalosh Seudot. V'lachen, it shouldn't be v'gachen. V'lachen nami livtzoa al shtei kikarot. They should also have lechem mishneh she'af hein hayo ba'oto hanes. They so in the miracle. So that is an idea which is found with regard to Ner Chanukah, around Kriyat Megillah, with regard to Arba Kosot, that those people that who were included in the miracle should be Mekayim the mitzvah that commemorates the miracle. Since women were involved with the Chanukah miracle, Purim miracle, the miracle of Yetziat Mitzrayim, so therefore they have a chiyuv in all of those mitzvot, Ner Chanukah, Arba Kosot. The Rabbeinu Tam says, that's the Gemara. The Rabbeinu Tam says, similarly, women ate the man also. So therefore they should have the mitzvah of Shalosh Seudot that commemorates the man. Okay. However, the Ran says, Ein Tzorech. However, that's what Rabbeinu Tam said, but it is superfluous. He's not wrong, but he gave a reason which isn't necessary. Why? Shebechol ma'aseh Shabbat ish v'isha shavin kidi alfinan v'zachor v'shamor. Generally speaking, why are women chayavot in kiddush? Women are chayavot in kiddush because they have a mitzvah of zachor. But zachor is a mitzvah aseh shahazman grama. It's a time-based mitzvah. Why should women be chayavot? So the answer is because women are chayavot in the mitzvah lo ta'aseh of shamor, and since zachor and shamor are connected at the hip, b'dibur echad nemru, so whoever has a chiyuv of shamor has a chiyuv of zachor. Women are chayavot. It's part of Shabbat. Now the Ran doesn't talk about Doraita de Rabbanan. I'm just pointing out that af hein hayu ba'oto hanes is never used, to the best of my knowledge, with regard to a mitzvah d'oraita. That's a terminology that is used to explain the three mitzvot d'Rabbanan. Why do you light Ner Chanukah? Why do you read the Megillah? Why do you drink Arba Kosot? Those are all mitzvot d'Rabbanan, rabbinic mitzvot that are associated with the holidays. And who's chayavot? Who chayav? Everyone, men and women are chayav in that mitzvah. Af hein hayu ba'oto hanes. If Rabbeinu Tam uses that terminology with regard to Seuda Shlishit, so that means that he understands that we're dealing with a Durham, and we're dealing with exactly the same kind of construct that we are dealing with those regard to those other three mitzvot. The Ran, by saying that it's unnecessary and saying it's part of Zachor and Shamor, that's a Doraita. With Zachor and Shamor, whoever is involved in the Zachor is involved in the Shamor, that has and everything that stems from it is that. So if the Ran seems to be leaning towards the Doraita side of things rather than the rabbinic side of things. We have when it comes to the Mishnah Berurah, by the way, with regard to Lechem Mishnah, again, uses the formulation Shehem Shayu Gam Kain B'Neis Haman. They also were in the nace of Haman, so of the man, not of Haman. Haman wasn't a nace. The idea of the man being a nace, so the Lechem Mishnah, at least based on the way the Mishnah Berurah is bringing it, seems to be a din d'Rabbanan, right? As opposed to what the Tazit said, that it's d'oraita. So it's not totally clear. It's a machloket throughout the generations as to whether or not the idea of Seuda Shlishit is d'oraita, whether it's d'Rabbanan. Based on what I said earlier, and I haven't, by the way, I didn't see anyone making this connection between the importance of Shalashudas as to the nature of Shabbat and the nature of the of one's being tested, as it were, in terms of worrying about what the future will bring by keeping Shabbat and the importance of keeping Shabbat under all circumstances. That is I think would lean more to the Doraita side, whereas if it's something which is, more of a question of within the oneg and why you have 3 meals, the hayoms, etc., that would be more on the rabbinic side. Do we have a mitzvah of Seuda Shlishit on Yom Tov? So we saw already that the Rambam said yes. However, this is not the accepted position lahalacha. The Tur and then the Shulchan Aruch say that even though there is lechem mishnah, right? This is the Taf Kuf here. It's source number 10, Taf Kuf Chaftet, which is the siman dealing with the mitzvot aseh of Yom Tov. So both the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch said chayav nivtsoa al shtei kikarot v'likva kol Seuda layayin v'lo nahagu la'asot bahen Seuda Shlishit. So you have on the one hand the mitzvah of Mishnah, but you do not have on Yom Tov the idea of having 3 meals. Why should that be? If they're all being learned from the same source, meaning that, either you should have, if you say that the man story is only relevant to Shabbat, then you shouldn't have Lechem Mishnah either on Yom Tov. If you're saying that it is relevant in some way to Yom Tov, so then you should have the 3 meals because there's a basic mitzvah of Oneg Yom Tov, the same way that there's a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat, right? So the Rambam seems to be pretty clear. It's consistent. Where does this inconsistency that we have in the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, and as I said, that's generally the custom that people are not makpid to eat 3 meals on Yom Tov. So one of the early commentaries on the Rambam, not a well-known commentary, Rabbi Menoch Minarvona, a provincial Rishon from the end of the 13th century, in his commentary to the Rambam, where he disagrees with the Rambam, he makes so you see already that it's going back to the 12th, 11th centuries, that there are people who disagree in not having 3 meals on Yom Tov. He says that it's based on the pasuk. We said before, back at the very beginning of the Shir, that we have the pasuk on pasuk Chav Gimel, where Vayomer Aleim Hu Asher Diber Hashem Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh. There's the term of Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh, and then you have the next pasuk, 2 pasukim later, pasuk Chav Hey, Vayomer Moshe Ichlu Hayom Shabbat Hayom Hayom Lo Timtzu Basadeh. Okay, so those 2 pasukim. So Rabbeinu Manoach says that those 2 pasukim are relevant in terms of making the distinction, and that's why on Yom Tov, Yom Tov has Shabbaton, l'rabot Yamim Tovim, that includes Yamim Tovim, Linyan Shalosh Sudot, but when it comes to the 3 meals, so that is Bayanichu Oto, and is a next part of the story. That already is not part of the Shabbaton structure, that is part of the Shabbat structure. That's something which is different, and that's why Seuda Shlishit does not apply on Yom Tov. Now, having said what we said until now, the question becomes, last few minutes of the shir, I want to focus on what you need to eat in Seuda Shlishit. And so here, the Rambam had said that because it's meals that are associated with the general mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat, so therefore you should have a mitzvah of Kiddush. You should have wine with your Seuda Shlishit, and you should have lechem Mishnah with Seuda Shlishit. As we all know, that we don't make Kiddush at Seuda Shlishit. There are those who will try to be, if you will, be Mekayim the Rambam and have a glass of wine with their Seuda Shlishit, though that is also relatively rare in terms of people who are makpid about that. And certainly we don't view it as Kiddush. Why not? So the Shulchan Aruch explains, number 13, number 12 was just the Rambam again. I'm not going to read the Rambam now because of the time, but that's what we already seen in the Rambam. Shulchan Aruch says, Ein tzarich l'kadesh b'Seuda Shlishit, aval tzarich liftsoa al shtei kikarot. So you don't have a mitzvah of Kiddush, but you do have a mitzvah of Lechem Mishnah. And then he talks about what happens if you don't have it. If you don't have the Lechem Mishnah, it's okay. And there is but why don't you have the Kiddush? So the Achronim on that line say the following. This is an important distinction between, if you will, the meals and the day. What do I mean? Mishnah Berurah number 14 says, Ein tzarich lekadesh. That's what the Shulchan Aruch said. Why not? Dahainu levarech al hayayin kodem hasuda, de'itkish yom l'layla le'inyan kiddush. So the reason is because, you ask a question, I'll ask a better question. Why should we have Kiddush during the day at all? After all, if you're Mekadesh the Shabbat, at the beginning of Shabbat, so you make Kiddush, and I say Mekadesh HaShabbat, and that continues. Why do I have a mitzvah of Kiddush in the morning at all? So that's a later takana of the Rabbanan, what's called Kiddush Rabbah. And so now the question is, well, I can look at it in one of two ways. I can look at it as basically saying that I'm extending this notion of being Mekadesh the Shabbat whenever I'm in a situation where I am engaged in Oneg Shabbat. So when I'm engaged in Oneg Shabbat, so I have a mitzvah of Kiddush on a rabbinic level. I don't say the Mekadesh Shabbat, it would be a bracha levatala. I don't have to say that bracha, but I have the wine, the same wine that I had on Friday night. So I have on Shabbat morning as well. And then it would follow that I should have it on Seuda Shlishit. That's the way the Rambam is understanding it. However, Shulchan Aruch is saying, no, it's not based on the meals. It's based on the nighttime as opposed to the daytime. So if I have the same way that on Friday night, if I were to decide to have 2 meals on Friday night, it's a winter night, and I have my Friday night meal early, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I have for whatever the reason, I go out, I meet with friends at 7, I come home, it's 11 o'clock, and I want to eat something else, and I make myself a sandwich. Should I make Kiddush on Friday night for that? No, because it's based on the nighttime. I already said Kiddush at the beginning of the night. That was the first Kiddush. So similarly, in the morning, I'm looking at the daytime as being a separate component of Shabbat, and that separate component deserves its own Kiddush. But once I make Kiddush in the morning, I don't have to make Kiddush in the rest of the day. However, and here's an interesting halacha in the footnote on that Mishnah Berurah in the Sha'ar Tziyun, he says the following: Nireli pashuti lo haya lo kos b'boker. If for whatever the reason a person did not have access to wine on Shabbat morning, and in fact you made your Kiddush, if you will, on bread. You just say, okay, you weren't able to make what we call Kiddush in the morning, and you had your meal, and you used the bread as to be Mekadesh on. So then, tzarich lahader lekadesh kodem hasuda b'suda shlishit. So then you should make Kiddush, but it has to be associated with a meal. So what's the meal that it's going to be associated with? Seuda Shlishit. It's not that we are saying Seuda Shlishit doesn't have its own Kiddush. It's that it's the daytime that has its Kiddush. So either the Kiddush is going to be associated with the Seuda Shniya in the morning, or it's going to be associated with Seuda Shlishit in the afternoon. But regardless, there is a Kiddush. So but that's the distinction. Rambam is viewing it as a mitzvah that is incumbent upon a person for each meal, whereas the halacha, as is followed today, is following based on the idea that the Kiddush is a mitzvah that's based on time periods and not based on each meal. Last point that I would like to raise, and has halacha l'maaseh ramifications. The halacha, we already saw a hint to it, where the Rambam said that the mitzvah of Seuda Shlishit does not necessarily have to be if a person is not feeling well or is feeling basically satiated and eating would not be part of oneg, but actually would be something which is painful for that person. So then there is no mitzvah of Seuda Shlishit. This reflects itself in the practice that we're all familiar with. Questions: do you have bread? Do you need to have lechem mishnah for the meal? So we've seen that ideally the answer is yes. Lechem mishnah, it connects with the overall idea of the man and the eating of the meals. So you should have lechem mishnah lechatchila, and obviously if you're having lechem mishnah, then you're eating bread. But because of the nature of our existence, in terms of the amount of bread that we're going to eat and how we have heavy meals, so the question developed: do you have to have bread for Seuda Shlishit? And there is the opinion of the Rambam that says yes, absolutely, categorically, you need to have lechem mishnah. However, the other opinions that have developed, and here I've just quickly brought in number 20, the idea, the way that the Shulchan Aruch phrases it, tzarich lasota b'pat, you should have bread. V'yesh omrim, and there are those who say you can make it on a mizonot, chameshet minei dagan, one of the 5 species of grain. Yesh omrim that yachol lasota b'dvarim shalaftim b'en b'anapat k'basar v'dagim avalo b'peirot. So you should have things which are considered to be more part of a meal and not part of a dessert. So you should have meat, fish, but not necessarily fruit, because fruit is something which is a dessert. You can have even something which is fruit. And the Shulchan Aruch says that ideally you should have bread, svara rishona ikar, tzarich lasot b'pat elim kenu saveh bioter, unless you are too satiated, and then you can follow one of those other ones. The Ramah points out that this has ramifications on Erev Pesach Shechaliyot b'Shabbat, so you can't eat bread in the afternoon. So what do you do? So the Ramah says you can eat one of those other things to fulfill the mitzvah. Okay, but my question is the following. So that's on that level. Can you do it in the other order? Okay, the 2-3 minutes that I have left. This happens frequently, especially in the winter. You come home from Shabbat Tefillah, Shacharit, and there's a kiddush. You have a cup of coffee, you have a piece of cake, you have a light meal, and you didn't make a motzi. And then an hour or so later, you have company coming after around 12 o'clock, 12:30. It's already in the afternoon, halachically. And then you have your lunch, and you have your lechem mishnah at lunch. And now it's, by the time you finish your meal, it's very late. So you have to have Shlishit, where you mekayim Seuda Shlishit with your lunch. And can you view your kiddush as having been your second meal, right? So I'm going to first say what you should do if you're going to do that, if you're not going to have a Shlishit. So ideally, you should wash with that second meal in the morning. In other words, when you come home from shul, you should have a couple of rolls there, make a motzi, make kiddush, make motzi on the lechem mishnah, and then your lunch will be considered Seuda Shlishit, especially if you're eating it. I didn't get into the question of can you eat Seuda Shlishit when it's before noon, before chatzot, but certainly if it's after chatzot, our lunches are after chatzot. When we in Shabbat, so then you can view your lunch as being Seuda Shlishit. So ideally, that's the way to go, right? You have your Seuda Shlishit, if you will, your Seuda, your first meal, breakfast, and then your Seuda Shlishit is the meal in the afternoon. But if you didn't do that, so can you in effect flip and have the second meal as being your first meal, as being the third meal, and your third meal being the second meal? Okay, no, it's that, since you're having the lechem mishnah at what is essentially your third meal, and this turns out to be a machloket between the different late achronim who discuss the question. They don't discuss the question usually directly. The question is usually brought up as a question of Birkat HaMazon, which unfortunately I've run out of time. I'm not going to get into the question of the Birkat HaMazon question. However, I'll just point out the two shitot. The Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata in here, source 25, source 26, it's his footnote on his explanation. So he says the following, that if you did not eat bread in the morning meal, so then Seuda Shlishit is considered to be the second meal. It's not considered to be the third meal, with the ramification that he brings with regard to Birkat HaMazon. And he explains in the footnote, Shamati me'agon Rav Shlomo Zalman Orbach Shlita, Zatzal, Daharei Mashanog Sharabim Mekachim Baboker V'ochlim Minei Mizonotam, Kavanatam Vadai Rak Latzet Yidei Kiddush B'Makom Seuda, Seudat Shabbat Shetzricha Pat. So he says that the kavanah, that when we have our piece of cake in the morning, that is not considered to be Seuda of Seuda Shabbat. It just allows not to have the problem of making Kiddush Shelo B'Makom Seuda. However, it's not considered to be a meal, and you need to have the meal which could be viewed as the third meal is really only the second meal, and you still need to have a Seuda Shlishit. Rabbi Yosef, on the other hand, and this is also the position of the Kaf HaChaim. So Rabbi Yosef says the following: Lufize me'achar kama poskim sovrim sheyotzim midei chovat Seuda shniya b'minei targima nimtzeit Seuda she'achar chatzot hayom haya Seuda shlishit im shachach Shabbat eino chozer. So therefore, what Rabbi Yosef says is that you can view the second meal as your third meal b'diavad. Again, everyone would agree that it's best not to get into this question because there is the machloket, and to have bread at your second meal and then to be viewing your lunch as the Seuda Shlishit. That would be the best situation, of course, unless you're going to have a real Seuda Shlishit, a fourth meal in the afternoon. In the summer, it's less of an issue. In the winter, it's a little pressed to do that. And so, keeping that in mind, but there is an opinion, and with this we'll close. There is an opinion that basically the food that you eat at your kiddush, even if you haven't made a motzi at that kiddush, can be considered to be your second meal, and then you'll be yotzei Seuda Shlishit b'diavad if you just by having your lunch later on in the day. Though, as I said, it's not universally held and should be avoided, but b'diavad you should be aware that shita exists as well. We should all be zocha. Getting back to the beginning of this year, we should all be zocha that our Seuda Shlishit should be eaten not just as a meal, but should be mikayem shalosh Seudot b'Shabbat, and therefore, and as a result, we will be saved from all of those terrible peraniot, Kavlo shel Mashiach, Dina shel Gehenom, Milchemet Magog. Have a wonderful Shabbat. Okay.
I'd like to make a comment.
Looking forward to seeing you all in person.
Can I make a comment, Rabbi?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
okay. Just two comments very quickly. Based on, I think this Rabbi Chidka was really onto something, because focusing on the word hayom, because first of all, with regard to whether you have to make kiddush on the day, it says zachor et yom HaShabbat Lakadsho. In other words, how are you Makayim Zocher on the day of Shabbos? Kiddush, which also means that the fourth meal has to be that Kiddush, which means that Kiddush after davening should be universal at shul.
Okay.
Okay, we should all do it, which is
Yes,
why.
I mean, now you could just say you've found a makor for kiddush clubs in shul.
Yes. Well, in Shul, which is why at Hashkama Nitzanim, when I and started a few years ago, we have Kiddush virtually almost every day after davening. It's a chiyuv. It's a chiyuv.
Okay, wonderful.
That's a way of getting a drink. But the fact, I have two questions for you if you have the time. First of all, on the man on Friday it was a double portion, so I could see they had extra.
Right.
So therefore, why the problem? They got double on Friday. So what were they scared of?
So I think that they were just simply scared. I think that on a pshat level, I think that they had a Depression era mentality. Or they were hoarders. If you say they were hoarders, then it answers the question. Right. I think that
they had to be hoarders, otherwise it's not a relevant situation.
Right. I think that especially if they're, when we talk about hoarders and we think of those people that we knew and know who were impacted by the events of the 30s and the 40s and became that way. So it even continued on in periods where, since World War II, periods of plenty, the last 70 plus years, but nevertheless, they were impacted psychologically by that even though they might be even wealthy people, not just comfortable people, nevertheless, they were the food, and especially around food, but also in general, what we call hoarders. And so certainly you can understand people who are going out of Egypt who are going to have that kind of mentality. All the more so when they're living in a desert. Yeah. And they can't assume, and that's what that Medrash continues and says, okay, what about tomorrow? Like we understand.
Double on Friday.
What?
Clearly, though, in terms of logic,
it came on Friday. Remember, this is the first Shabbat, so they don't know what happened on Sunday.
Okay, this is the first Shabbat. Once it's so.
And so I think that what Seuda Shlishit did, what they were asking Moshe was, or what Moshe added to them was saying, don't hold back on your Seuda Shlishit. Whereas if there probably were people who were saying, maybe we should save our man for Sunday morning. Maybe it's not going to fall tomorrow, and we should have some food available for us tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so that's why Moshe said, that's why it becomes a source of mitzvah Seuda Shlishit. No, don't worry, eat it today. Worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will be taken care of. God will take care of you. But right now, enjoy your Seuda Shlishit.
Which is bigger than ever before.
Seuda Shlishit.
One question. So if it's a psychological question, understand it. Second question, breakfast. What does breakfast count? If people have breakfast 2 times Shabbos morning, can that be turned into account for a Seuda?
Yeah, I mean, when I come home from my, usually I come home from, let's say the 6:30 minyan, but even if I come home from a later minyan, so I'll make Kiddush, I'll take a couple of rolls, I'll make Kiddush, and I'll have my breakfast on Lechem Mishnah, and then my lunch is going to, when I eat with the family, usually it'll be 4 meals because we'll sit down for a piece of cake after when everybody else comes home from shul.
Right. That's daylight. But what about there's all of this ambiguity of the nighttime? Like Friday night dinner.
Yeah.
We treat it, and it is the first of Shabbos.
Right.
So that means you've got 1 down, 2 to go.
Right.
So it could be breakfast, or it could be lunch, or it could be Seuda Shlishit.
Well, Seuda Shlishit won't be 2 to go. It will only be 1 to go.
Yeah.
So you have to, generally speaking, what they ate, and let's keep in mind, is that they would have a very light breakfast, if anything, and every day of the week. They would have, we talk about breakfast being the most important meal of the day, but
not on Shabbos.
They viewed it. They would eat a quick snack.
Yeah.
In the morning, whatever it was, and then basically what we let's say have a I don't know ma'afeh v'kafeh, right? That would be their breakfast.
Anybody say that it's
Their main meal would be lunch, and then they wouldn't eat much at all in the evening. They would have a very light meal in the evening. That's what that was what they normally would do. So Seuda Shlishit meant that they had two main meals on. That's why the third meal is extra. In other words, they would still eat something before they went to sleep. Let's say, call it Malava Malka, but it's not a really part and parcel of their diet. It was the extra meal of a real meal was Seuda Shlishit.
Now, does anybody cut out Friday night and says 3 meals on Shabbat day?
Yeah, that was what Rabbi Zrika was saying.
Yeah.
Rabbi Chidka, excuse me. He was saying the 3 meals are only on Shabbat day. Shabbat night isn't even included in the count.
And that's always personally, if you observe life, Friday night dinner with Kiddush and guests is probably the highlight of the Shabbos.
Okay, could be. For most people, I think most of us prefer I think Friday night meal is the best meal. It's also when the food is its freshest.
Yeah.
Unless you really like chulent.
Aside from what we all like, you're at liberty. It's nighttime.
Right.
The Shabbos day comes at night.
Well, that's because this year is in the winter. I don't know if you'll say that in the summer, that you feel at liberty on a Friday.
I found it very amusing, and I've talked to my wife about it, that I was having a debate with her about Seuda Shlishit, and we do what you said about no wine, a piece of matzah, 2 pieces of matzah.
Right.
That covers it. So I feel I've done my duty. Thank you very much.
Okay. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. And regards.
What a nice, patient man.